everyone, so glad to be back with you all. Let me just adjust my camera a little bit. There we go. You don't need to see my big trees of knitting yarn, do you? Maybe you would like to see my big trees of knitting yarn. Let me just move it again and show you. See all that knitting yarn? Do you think I'll ever get knitted up in my lifetime? Maybe not. That's not what we're here for tonight. We're here to go back to the last battle, and we're at chapters 11 and 12 tonight. And it's been a rough go, hasn't it? Oh my. Poor Tyrion has discovered that what is that ape's name? Shift and the Calormen Rishtatar Khan have completely bamboozled all the Narnians, that it looks like there's just going to be a complete disaster where all the Narnian animals and he himself and his army are going to be destroyed and carried off to Calormen or killed on the spot, and everything looks pretty bleak. Let's see if things improve a little in these chapters. All right, this is chapter 11. The pace quickens. Quick as lightning, Rishtatar Khan leaped back out of the reach of the king's sword. Let's just read the last few words of the last chapter to find out why Rishtatar Khan is leaping back. The next minute, the astonished Narnians saw 7 figures leap forth in front of the stable, 4 of them in shining chain mail. The king's sword flashed in the firelight, and he waved it above his head and cried in a great voice, "Here I stand, Tyrion of Narnia, in Aslan's name, to prove with my body that Tash is a foul fiend, the ape is a manifold traitor, and those Calormenes are worthy of death. To my side, all true Narnians. Why do you want to wait until your masters have killed you one by one?" Quick as lightning, Rishtatar Khan leaped back out of the reach of the king's sword. He was no coward, and he would have fought single-handedly against Tyrion and the dwarf if need be, but he couldn't take on the eagle and the unicorn as well. He knew how eagles can fly into your face and peck at your eyes and blind you with their wings, and he had heard from his father, who had met Narnians in battle, that no man, except for one armed with arrows or a long spear, can match a unicorn, for it rears up on its hind legs as it falls upon you, and then you have its hoofs and its horn to contend with. So he rushed into the crowd and stood, calling out, "To me, warriors of the Tisrock, may he live forever. To me, all loyal Narnians, lest the wrath of Tashlan fall on you." While all this was happening, 2 other things were happening as well. The ape had not realized his danger as quickly as Tarkhan. For a second or so, he remained squatting by the fire, staring at the newcomers. Then Tyrion rushed upon the wretched creature, picked him up by the scruff of the neck, and dashed back to the stable, shouting, "Open the door!" Poggin opened it. "Go and drink your own medicine, Shift," said Tyrion, and hurled the ape through the darkness and closed the door. But as the door was banged shut again by the dwarf, a blinding greenish-blue light shone out from the inside of the stable. The earth shook, and there was a strange noise, a clucking and a screaming, as if it was the hoarse voice of some monstrous bird. The beasts moaned and howled and called out, "Tashlan, hide us from him!" And many fell down and hid their faces in their wings or their paws. No one, except Farsight the eagle, who has the best eyes of all living things, noticed the face of Rishtatar Khan at that moment. And from what Farsight saw, he knew at once that Rishtatar Khan was just as surprised and nearly as frightened as everybody else. "There goes someone," thought Farsight, "who has called on gods he does not believe in. How will it be with him if they have really come?" The third thing, which also happened at the same moment, was the only really beautiful thing that night. Every single talking dog in the whole meeting, and there were 15 of them, came bounding and barking joyously to the king's side. They were mostly great big dogs with thick shoulders and heavy jaws. and their coming was like the breaking of a great wave on the seashore. It nearly knocked you down. For though they were talking dogs, they were still just as doggy as they could be, and they stood with their front paws on the shoulders of the humans and licked their faces and said at once, "Welcome, welcome, we'll help. Show us how to help, show us how to how. It was all so lovely that it made you want to cry. This, at least, was the sort of thing they had been hoping for, and when, a moment later, a few little animals, mice and moles and a squirrel or two, came pattering up, squealing with joy and saying, "See, we're here," and after that the bear and the boar came too, Eustace began to feel that maybe, after all, everything might be going to come out right. But Tyrion gazed around and saw that very few of the animals had moved. To me, he called. "Have you all turned cowards since I became your king?" "We dare not," whimpered a dozen voices. "Tashlan would be angry. Shield us from Tashlan." "Where are all the talking horses?" asked Tyrion. We've seen, squealed the mice. "The ape has made them work. They're all tied up down at the bottom of the hill." "Then, all you little ones, you nibblers and gnawers and nutcrackers, away with you, as fast as you can scamper, and see if the horses are on our side. And if they are, you get your teeth into their ropes and gnaw until the horses are free, and bring them to me." "With a good will, sire," came the small voices, and with a whisk of tails, those sharp-eyed and sharp-toothed little folks were off. Tyrion smiled for love as he saw them go, but it was already time to be thinking about other things. Rishtatar Khan was giving his orders. "Forward!" he yelled. "Take all of them alive if you can, and throw them into the stable or drive them into it. When they're all in there, we'll set fire to it and make them an offering to the great god Tash." "Ha," so Farsight thought to himself. "This is how he hopes to win Tash's pardon for his unbelief." The enemy line, about half of Rishta's force, was now moving forward, and Tyrion barely had time to give his orders. "On the left, Jill, and try to shoot all you can before they reach us. Boar and Bear next to her. Poggin on my left. Eustace on my right. Hold the right wing, Jewel. Stand by him, Puzzle, and use your hoofs. Hover and strike, Farsight. You dogs, just behind us. Go in among them after the swordplay has begun, and may Aslan come to our aid." Eustace stood with his heart beating terribly, hoping that he would be brave. He had never seen anything, although he had seen both a dragon and a sea serpent, that made his blood run as cold as that line of dark-faced, bright-eyed men. There were 15 Calormenes, a talking bull of Narnia, Slinky the fox, and Raggle the satyr. Then he heard twang and zip on his left, and one Calormene fell, and then twang and zip again, and the satyr was down. "Oh, well done, daughter," came Tyrion's voice, and then the enemy were upon them. Eustace could never remember what happened in the next 2 minutes. It was all like a dream, the sort of dream you have when your temperature is over 100, until he heard Rishtatar Khan's voice calling out from the distance, "Retire, back hither, and reform." Then Eustace came to his senses and saw that the Calormenes were scampering back to their friends, but not all of them. 2 lay dead, pierced by Jewel's horn, one by Tyrion's sword. The fox lay dead at his own feet, and he wondered if he was the one who had killed it. The bull was also down, by an arrow from Jill. But our side had its losses too. 3 dogs were killed, and a 4th one was hobbling behind the line on 3 legs and whimpering. The bear lay on the ground, moving feebly. Then he mumbled in his throaty voice, bewildered to the last, I don't understand." And he laid his big head down on the grass as quietly as a child going to sleep, and never moved again. In fact, the first attack had failed. Eustace didn't seem to be able to be glad about it. He was so terribly thirsty, and his arm ached so. As the defeated Calormenes went back to their commander, the dwarfs began jeering at them. "Had enough, darkies?" they yelled. Don't you like it? Why doesn't your great Targon go and fight himself instead of sending you all to be killed? Poor Calormenes. Dwarfs, cried Tyrion, come here and use your swords and not your tongues. There's still time. Dwarfs of Narnia, you can fight well, I know. Come back to me. Yeah, yelled the dwarfs, not likely. You're just as big a humbug as the other lot. We don't want any kings. The dwarves are for the dwarfs. Boo! And then the drum began. Not a dwarf drum this time, but a big Calormene drum. The children from the very first hated the sound. Boom, boom, ba-boom, it went. But they would have hated it far worse if they had known what it meant. Tyrion did. It meant that there were other Calormene troops nearby, and that Rishta Tarkan was calling them to come to his aid. Tyrion and Jewel looked at one another sadly. They had just begun to hope that they might win that night, but it would be all over with them if new enemies appeared. Tyrion gazed despairingly around. Several Narnians were standing with the Calormenes, whether through treachery or honest fear. Others were sitting still, staring, not likely to join either side. But there were fewer animals now. The crowd was much smaller. Clearly, some of them had just crept quietly away during the fighting. Boom, boom, ba-ba-boom, went the horrible drum. And then another sound began to mix with it. Listen, said Jewel, and then look, said Farsight. And a moment later, there was no doubt what it was. With a thunder of hoofs, with tossing heads, wide nostrils, and waving manes, came a score of talking horses of Narnia charging up the hill. The gnawers and the nibblers had done their work. Puggin the dwarf and the children opened their mouths to cheer, but the cheer never came. Suddenly, the air was full of arrows, the twanging of bowstrings. It was the dwarfs who were shooting, and for a moment Jill could hardly believe her eyes. They were shooting the horses. Dwarfs are deadly archers. Horse after horse rolled over. Not one of those noble beasts ever reached the king. You little swine, shrieked Eustace, dancing in his rage. You treacherous little brutes. Even Jewel said, Shall I run after those dwarfs, sire, and spit 10 of them on my horn at each plunge? But Tyrion, with his face as stern as stone, said, Stand fast, Jewel. If you must weep, sweetheart, this was to Jewel, turn your face aside and don't you wet your bowstring. And peace, Eustace, don't scold like a kitchen girl. No warrior scolds. Courteous words or else hard knocks are our only language. But the dwarfs jeered back at Eustace. That was a surprise for you, little boy, eh? Thought we were on your side, did you? No fear, we don't want any talking horses. We don't want you to win any more than we want the other side to win. You can't take us in. The dwarfs are for the dwarfs. Rishta Tarkan was still talking to his men, doubtless making arrangements for the next attack, and probably wishing he had sent his whole force in at first. The drum boomed on. And then, to their horror, Tyrion and his friends heard, far fainter as if for a long way off, an answering drum. Another body of Calormenes had heard Rishta's signal and were coming to support him. You couldn't have known it from Tyrion's face that he had now given up all hope. Listen, he whispered in a matter-of-fact voice. We must attack now, before those men over there are strengthened by their friends. But do you think, sire, said Puggin, that here we have the good wooden wall of the stable at our backs? If we advance, we'll be encircled and get sword points between our shoulders. I would say what you say, dwarf, said Tyrion. Was it not their very plan to force us into the stable? The further we are from its deadly door, the better. The king is right, said Farsight. Away from this cursed stable and whatever goblin lives inside at all costs. Oh, yes, said Eustace. I'm coming to hate the very sight of it. Good, said Tyrion. Now, look yonder to our left. You see that great rock that gleams white against like marble in the firelight? First, we will fall upon those Calormenes, and you, maiden, shall move on out to our left and shoot as fast as ever you can into their ranks. And you, eagle, fly into their faces from the right. Meanwhile, we others will be charging them. When we are so close, Jill, that you can no longer shoot at them for fear of striking us, go back to the white rock and wait. And you others, keep your ears wide open, even in the fighting. We must put them to flight in a few minutes or else not at all, for we are fewer than they. And as soon as I call back, then rush to join Jill at the White Rock, where we will have protection behind us and we can breathe for a while. Now, off with you, Jill. Feeling terribly alone, Jill ran out about 20 feet, put her right leg back and her left leg forward, and set an arrow on her string. She wished her hands weren't shaking so. That's a rotten shot, she said, as her first arrow sped toward the enemy and flew over their heads. But she had another arrow on the string in a moment, and she knew that speed was what mattered. She saw something big and black darting into the face of the Calormenes. That was Farsight the eagle. First one man and then another dropped his sword and put both his hands up to defend his face. Then one of her own arrows hit a man and another hit a Narnian wolf, who had, it seemed, joined the enemy. But she had been shooting only for a few seconds when she had to stop. With a flash of swords and one of the boar's tusks and Jewel's horn, and with deep baying from the dogs, Tyrion and his party were rushing on the enemies like men in a 100-yard dash. Jill was astonished to see how unprepared the Calormenes seemed to be. She didn't realize that this was the result of her work and the eagles. Very few troops can keep looking steadily to the front if they're getting arrows on their face from one side and being pecked by an eagle on the other side. Oh, well done, shouted Jill. The king's party were cutting their way right into the enemy. The unicorn was tossing men like you'd toss hay on a fork. Even Eustace seemed to Jill, who, after all, didn't know very much about swordsmanship, to be fighting brilliantly. The dogs were at the Calormenes' throats. It was going to work. It was victory at last. But with a horrible cold shock, Jill noticed a strange thing. Though the Calormenes were falling at each Narnian side sword stroke, they never seemed to get any fewer. In fact, there were actually more of them now than there were before the fight started. There were more every second. They were running up from every side. These were new Calormenes. These new ones had spears. And there was such a crowd of them that she could hardly see her own friends. And then she heard Tyrion's voice calling, "Back to the rock!" The enemy had been reinforced. The drum had done its work. Whew. Ready for chapter 12? Through the stable door. Jill ought to have been back at the White Rock already, but she had quite forgotten that part of her orders in the excitement of watching the fight. Now she remembered, and she turned at once and ran to it, and arrived there just a second before the others. And it thus happened that all of them, for a moment, had their backs to the enemy. But they all wheeled around the moment they had reached it, and a terrible sight met their eyes. A Calormene was running toward the stable door, carrying something that kicked and struggled. And as he came between them and the fire, they could see clearly both the shape of the Calormene and the shape of what he carried. It was Eustace. Tyrion and Unicorn rushed out to rescue him, but the Calormene was far nearer to the door than they, and before they had covered half the distance, he had opened the door, flung Eustace in, and shut the door on him. And half a dozen more Calormenes had run up behind him. They formed a line on the open space in front of the table. There was no getting at it now. Even then, Jill managed to keep her face turned aside, well away from her bow. "Even I can't stop blubbering. I'm not going to get my bowstring wet," she said. "Beware the arrows," said Poggin suddenly. Everybody ducked and pulled his helmet well over his nose. The dogs crouched behind, but though a few arrows came their way, it soon became clear that they were not being shot at. Griffel and his dwarfs were at their archery again. This time they were coolly shooting the Calormenes. "Keep it up, boys," came Griffel's voice. "All together, carefully. We don't want Calormenes any more than we want monkeys or lions or kings. The dwarfs are for the dwarfs." Whatever else you may say about dwarfs, you can't say they aren't brave. They could easily have gotten away to a safe place. They preferred to stay and kill as many of both sides as they could, except when both sides were kind enough to save them the trouble by killing each other. They wanted Narnia for their own. What perhaps they had not taken into account was that the Calormenes had chain mail on, and the horses had had no protection. Also, the Calormenes had a leader, and Reshtatar Khan's voice cried out, "30 of you keep watch on those fools by the White Rock, and the rest come after me that we may teach these sons of earth, these dwarfs, a lesson." Tyrion and his friends, still panting from their fight and thankful for a few minutes' rest, stood and looked on while the Tarkhan led his men against the dwarfs. It was a strange scene by now. The fire had sunk lower. The light it gave was now less and of a darker red. And as far as one could see, the whole place of assembly was now empty, except for the dwarfs of the Calormenes. In that light, you couldn't really make out much of what was happening. It sounded as if the dwarfs were putting up a good fight. Tyrion could hear Griffel using dreadful language, and every now and then the Tarkhan calling, "Take all you can alive, take them alive." Whatever that fight might have been like, it didn't last long. The noise of it died away. Then Jill saw the Tarkhan coming back to the stable, 11 men following him, dragging 11 dwarfs tied up. Whether the others had all been killed or whether some of them had gotten away, it was never known. "Throw them into the shrine of Tash," said Rishtatar Khan. And when the 11 dwarfs, one after another, had been flung or kicked into that dark doorway, and the door had been shut again, he bowed low to the stable and said, "These also are for your burnt offering, Lord Tash." And all the Calormenes banged the flats of their swords on their shields and shouted, "Tash, Tash, the great god Tash, the inexorable Tash." There was no nonsense about Tashland now. The little party by the White Rock watched these doings and whispered to one another. They had found a trickle of water coming down the rock, and they had all had a wonderful drink, Jill and Poggin and the king in their hands, while the four-footed ones lapped from the little pool which had formed at the foot of the stone. Such was their thirst that they thought it was the most delicious drink they had ever had in their lives, and while they were drinking, they were perfectly happy and couldn't think of anything else. "I feel in my bones," said Poggin, "that we shall all, one by one, pass through that dark door before morning. I can think of 100 ways I would rather have died than go through that door." "Indeed, it is a grim door," said Tyrion. "It is more like a gaping mouth." "Oh, can't we do anything to stop it?" said Jill in a shaking voice. "Nay, fair friend," said Jewel, nosing her gently. "It may be for us the door to Aslan's country, and we shall sup at his table tonight." Rishtatar Khan turned his back on the stable and walked slowly to a place in front of the White Rock. "Hearken," he said. "If the boar and the dogs and the unicorn will come over to me and put themselves in my mercy, their lives shall be spared. The boar shall go into a cage in the Tisrock's garden, the dogs to the Tisrock's kennel, and the unicorn, when I have sawed its horn off, shall draw a cart. But the eagle, the children, and he who was the king shall be offered to Tash this night." The answer was only growls. "Go on, warriors," said the Tarkhan. "Kill the beasts, but take the two-legged ones alive." And then the last battle of the last king of Narnia began. What made it hopeless, even apart from the number of the enemy, was the spears. The Calormenes who had been with the ape almost from the beginning had no spears, and that was because they had come into Narnia by ones and twos, pretending to be peaceful merchants. And of course, they carried no spears, for a spear is not a thing you could hide. The new ones must have come in later, after the ape was already strong and they could march in openly. And those spears made all the difference. With a long spear, you can kill a boar before you're in reach of his tusks, and a unicorn before you're in reach of his horn. And if you're very quick and you keep your head. And now the level spears were closing in on Tyrion and his last friends. Next minute, they were all fighting for their lives. In a way, it wasn't as bad as you might think. When you are using every muscle to the full, ducking under a spear point here, leaping over it there, lunging forward, drawing back, wheeling around, you don't have much time to feel either frightened or sad. Tyrion knew he could do nothing for the others now. They were all doomed together. He vaguely saw the boar go down on one side of him and Jewel fighting furiously on the other. Out of the corner of one eye, he saw, but only just saw, a big Calormene pulling Jill away somewhere by her hair. But he hardly thought about any of those things. His only thought now was to sell his own life as dearly as he could. The worst part of it was that he couldn't keep to the position in which he had started under the White Rock. A man who is fighting a dozen enemies at once must take his chances wherever he can, must dart in wherever he sees an enemy or unguarded, and in a very few strokes, this may get you quite a distance from the spot where you began. Tyrion soon found that he was getting further and further to the right, nearer and nearer to the stable. He had a vague idea in his mind that there was a good reason for keeping away from it, but he couldn't remember now what that reason was. And anyway, he couldn't help it. All at once, everything came quite clear. He found he was fighting the Tarkhan himself. The bonfire, what was left of it, was straight in front. He was, in fact, fighting in the very doorway of the stable, for it had opened, and two Calormenes were holding the door, ready to slam it shut on anything that came in. He remembered everything now, and he realized that the enemy had been edging him over to the stable on purpose ever since the fight began. And while he was thinking this, he was still fighting the Tarkhan as hard as he could. A new idea came into Tyrion's head. He dropped his sword, darted forward, in under the sweep of the Tarkhan's scimitar, seized his enemy by the belt with both hands, and jumped into the stable himself, shouting, "Come in and meet Tash yourself." There was a deafening noise. As when the ape had been flung in, the earth shook, and there was a blinding light. The Calormene soldiers outside screamed, "Tash, Tash!" and slammed the door. If Tash wanted their own captain, Tash can have him. They, at any rate, did not want to meet Tash. For a moment or two, Tyrion didn't even know where he was, or even who he was. Then he steadied himself and blinked and looked around. It was not dark inside the stable as he had expected. He was in strong light. That's why he was blinking. He turned to look at Rishta Tarkhan, but Rishta was not looking at him. Rishta gave a great wail and pointed. Then he put his hands before his face and fell down flat on the ground. And Tyrion looked in the direction where the Tarkhan had pointed, and then he understood. A terrible figure was coming toward them. It was far smaller than the shape they had seen from the tower, though much bigger than a man, and it was the same. It had a vulture's head and 4 arms. Its beak was open, and its eyes blazed, and a croaking voice came from its beak. "You have called me into Narnia, Rishta Tarkhan. Here am I. What do you have to say?" But the Tarkhan neither lifted his face from the ground nor said a word. He was shaking like a man with bad hiccups. He was brave enough in battle, but half his courage had left him earlier that night when he first began to suspect that there might be a real Tash. And the rest of his courage had left him now. With a sudden jerk, like a hen stooping to pick up a worm, Tash pounced on the miserable Rishta and tucked him under the upper of his 2 right arms. There you have it. There is the horrible Tash with his beak like a vulture and his forearms, and he's got Rishta Tarkan tucked under one of his arms. Tash pounced on the miserable Rishta and tucked him under the upper of his two arms. Then Tash turned his head sideways to fix Tyrion with one of those terrible eyes, for, of course, having a bird's head, he couldn't look at you straight. But immediately from behind Tash, strong and calm as a summer sea, a voice said, "Begone, monster, and take your lawful prey to your own place, in the name of Aslan, and in the name of the great father, emperor over the sea." Who do you think is speaking? You're right. The hideous creature vanished with the Tarkan still under its arm, and Tyrion turned to see who had spoken. And what he saw then set his heart beating as it never had in any fight. 7 kings and queens stood before him, all with crowns on their heads, and all in glittering clothes. But the king wore fine chain mail. The kings wore fine chain mail and had their swords drawn in their hands. Tyrion bowed courteously and was about to speak when the youngest of the queens laughed. He stared hard at her face and gasped with astonishment. He knew who it was. It was Jill. But not Jill as he had last seen her, with her face all dirt and tears and an old school dress half slipping off one shoulder. Now she looked cool and fresh as if she had just come from bathing. And at first he thought that she looked older, but then he thought she didn't, and he couldn't make up his mind. And then he saw that the youngest of the kings was Eustace. But he was also changed, as Jill was changed. Here's a picture of them all. I bet you could say all their names, couldn't you? Tyrion suddenly felt awkward about coming among these people with blood and dust and the sweat of a battle all over him. But the next moment, he realized that he wasn't in that state at all. He was fresh and cool and clean and dressed in such clothes as he would have worn to a great feast at Cair Paravel. But in Narnia, your good clothes were never your uncomfortable ones. They knew how to make things that felt beautiful as well as looking beautiful in Narnia. There was no such thing as starch or flannel or elastics to be found from one end of the country to the next. "Sire," said Jill, coming forward and making a beautiful curtsy, "let me introduce you to Peter, the High King over all the kings of Narnia." Tyrion had no need to ask which one was the High King, for he remembered his face, though here it was far nobler than in his dream. He stepped forward, sank to one knee, and kissed Peter's hand. "High King, you are welcome." And the High King raised him and kissed him on both cheeks, as a High King should. And then he led Tyrion to the oldest of the queens. But even she was not old, and there were no gray hairs in her head and no wrinkles on her cheek. And he said, "Sir, this is Lady Polly, who came into Narnia on the first day, when Aslan made the trees grow and the beasts talk." And then he led him to a man whose golden beard flowed over his breast and whose face was full of wisdom. "And this," he said, "is the Lord Diggory, who was with her on that day. And this is my brother, King Edmund, and this is my sister, the Queen Lucy." "Sir," said Tyrion when he had greeted all of these, "if I read the chronicles right, shouldn't there be another? Has not your majesty 2 sisters? Where is Queen Susan?" "My sister Susan," said Peter shortly and gravely, "is no longer a friend of Narnia." "Yes," said Eustace, "and whenever you've tried to get her to come and talk about Narnia or to do anything about Narnia, she always says, 'What wonderful memories you have. Fancy you still thinking about all those funny games we used to play when we were children.'" "Oh, Susan," said Jill, "she's interested in nothing nowadays except lipstick and invitations to parties. She was always a jolly sight too keen on being a grown-up." "Grown up indeed," said Lady Polly. "I wish she would grow up. She wasted all her school time wanting to be the age she is now, and she wasted all the rest of her life trying to stay that age. Her whole idea is to race on to the silliest time of one's life as quick as you can and then stop there as long as you can. Well, let's not talk about that now, said Peter. Look, here are some lovely fruit trees. Let's taste them. And then, for the first time, Tyrion looked around and realized how very queer this adventure was. That's the end of chapter 12. Well, we've got some things to think about, don't we? What has gone on? What happened when they went through that door of the stable? Was Tash real? Oh, yes, he was. Yes, he was. Was Tash good? Oh, no, he wasn't. Was he more powerful than Aslan? Oh, no, he's not. When Aslan commanded him to take what was rightly his and to leave and come back no more, he had to obey. He may not have wanted to, but he had to. He had to leave. That's a good thing to remember. Is Satan real? Oh, yes, he is. Is he powerful? Yes, indeed he is. Is he more powerful than Jesus? Oh, no, he's not. Does he have to obey Jesus? Yes, he does. Yes, he does. That's a comforting thing for us to remember. Satan is always trying to tempt us to do the wrong thing, but the Lord Jesus is more powerful than he is. And if we ask the Lord Jesus to help us, he will help us to resist the temptation and not do it. Why should we do anything that wants to please Satan? He's got no love for us in his heart. He's got only hatred and evil in his heart. When he tempts you to do things, you can be sure it's not for your good. And no, not at all. We listen to Jesus, don't we? We read our Bibles, we find out what Jesus wants us to do, and we just do it. It's as easy as that, isn't it? Or as hard as that, as the case may be. Anyway, that's an exciting way to end our story for tonight. I'm looking forward to seeing you next time when we go on and see what happens next. Bye for now, everybody.